Once upon a time, hidden behind the southern wall of a worn-out palace, there was a narrow stone chamber, damp, crooked, and barely large enough for a boy to stand upright. That's where Eliakim worked. Not as a scribe, not as a soldier, just a quiet servant with a broom and a worn-out cloth, sweeping floors beneath the feet of men who barely noticed he existed. And that was fine with him. Every morning he rose before the city stirred and walked barefoot through the broken courtyard, past the cracked pillars, into the small space between two leaning stone walls. His job was simple: sweep the dust, clean the soot, polish the brass basins, and stay invisible. Above him, the real decisions were being made, loud voices echoing through the stone corridors of the royal court. Arguments, strategies, fear-filled whispers about the Assyrian army pressing closer every day. Sometimes he listened, sometimes he tried not to, but he always remembered. One name echoed more than the rest: Shebna, the palace steward. He was the man in charge of the king's household, the one with the royal seal, the one who shouted the loudest and bowed the least. He was powerful, important, untouchable. And lately, he had started building himself a tomb. Not just any tomb, a monument carved from stone near the king's burial field, larger than most generals' houses. The guards whispered about it behind closed doors. He's building it, like he already rules. Like he wants to be remembered more than he wants to serve. Still, Eliakim kept to his duties. He didn't speak. He didn't boast. He swept the room beneath the wall, but the prophet Isaiah kept speaking. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The Lord will remove Shebna from his position. He will replace him with a faithful servant, one who will carry the key to the house of David. No one paid him much attention, until one morning, everything changed. Eliakim had just finished polishing the brass basins when a commotion erupted in the upper court. Sandals thundered across stone, soldiers shouted, doors slammed, servants scattered. Eliakim froze near the shadowed archway, clutching the edge of the water basin as heavy boots rushed past him. Then came Shebna, red-faced, stumbling, furious. And behind him walked King Hilkiah, flanked by guards, holding a scroll. At his side, the prophet Isaiah. The king paused right in front of Eliakim. The young man dropped his cloth and bowed his head, unsure whether to speak or run. King Hezekiah's voice was calm. "Your name is Eliakim, son of Hilkiah." Eliakim nodded, unsure if his knees would hold. "Yes, my king." Isaiah stepped forward, his eyes firm. Hezekiah lifted a ring from his hand, the seal of the palace steward. "Then rise," the king said. "Today, the key passes to you." And in that moment, the boy from the room beneath the wall was chosen. Not because he was loud, not because he asked, but because God saw him ready. The palace felt larger the next morning. Not because the walls had changed, but because Eliakim had. The steward's seal hung around his neck now, heavy, bronze, and etched with the mark of the royal house. Just one glance at it, and servants stepped aside. Guards saluted. Officials, who hadn't known his name a day earlier, suddenly bowed as he passed. But Eliakim didn't walk taller, he walked slower. Like the stone hallways beneath his feet were testing every step. By midday, he had been handed scrolls by 3 scribes, greeted by 5 elders, and interrupted 6 times by messengers asking for decisions he didn't know how to make. The king's water cistern needs repairs. The southern gate steward has resigned. The Assyrians are requesting terms again. Each voice pushed on him like wind, but he said the same thing every time. Let me pray on it. Then he walked away and prayed hard. That evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, Eliakim stood alone in the court of the scribes, his hands pressed against the cool stone of the palace wall. "Why me?" he whispered. "I'm not a ruler. I'm not ready. I used to sweep this floor." He closed his eyes. "Lord, if you raised me, then teach me how not to fall." A rustle behind him broke the quiet. Eliakim turned to see a figure in faded linen, leaning calmly against a pillar. It was Isaiah. The prophet walked forward slowly, his sandals soft against the stone. "Most men rush when they are given power," Isaiah said. "You pause. That is good." Eliakim bowed slightly. "I don't know how to do this." Shebna ran the court for years. He had soldiers, gold, connections. Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "And now he has a tomb." The words hung in the air like smoke. Isaiah reached into his robe and pulled out a scroll smaller than the rest, its seal broken, its edges worn. "I wrote this weeks ago," the prophet said, "before the king ever called your name." He handed the scroll to Eliakim. The young man unrolled it slowly. It read, "I will summon my servant, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with your robe and fasten your sash around him. I will give him authority. He will be a father to those in Jerusalem. And I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David." Eliakim looked up, stunned. "That's me?" Isaiah nodded. "God sees who we are, even before the world does. This isn't about what you've done. It's about what God is doing." The prophet stepped closer, placing a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "The key he gave you? It opens doors no one else can open. It also shuts what must stay shut. But it is not made of bronze or wood or gold. It is made of trust." Eliakim swallowed hard. "What if I make mistakes?" Isaiah's eyes softened. "You will. But if you keep listening to God, not to your pride, you will lead well." The wind picked up slightly as the sun finally dipped below the hill, and for the first time, Eliakim didn't feel afraid. He felt assigned. He wasn't carrying a title. He was carrying a calling. The next morning, Eliakim stood at the head of a table he'd never sat at before. The council room was colder than he remembered, even though the sun blazed outside. The walls were lined with scrolls and weapons, two kinds of power, and the men seated around the table had wielded both for years. Old voices, familiar faces, but now they were looking to him, not as a servant, as steward. "The issue is the gates," one elder said, tapping a long, ink-stained finger on the parchment in front of him. "Too many refugees are entering Jerusalem. The southern entry must be sealed." "It's too dangerous," another added. "If the Assyrians attack and the city is crowded, we'll fall from within." "They're strangers, not citizens. They drain our food supply. And some are just pretending to be Hebrews to sneak inside." Eliakim listened. He didn't speak. Not yet. He had seen the crowds himself, mothers carrying toddlers, men limping from long journeys, children with swollen feet. Entire families who had fled nearby towns, hoping Jerusalem would take them in before the Assyrians crushed everything behind them. He'd handed water to some, prayed with others, saw the fear in their eyes. They weren't invaders. They were desperate. He finally raised his voice. "We will not shut the southern gate." Silence. One of the elders scoffed, "If they overrun us, you'll regret that." Eliakim met his eyes, steady and calm. "If we lose our mercy, we've already been overrun." The room tensed. Someone shifted in their seat. "You're young," a commander said, "and new. You don't know what war does." Eliakim nodded. "You're right. I don't. But I know what fear does, and I won't let it rule this house." Another elder leaned in. "You'll lose favor with the nobles, with the wealthy." Eliakim folded his hands. "Then I lose favor. But I will not lose my soul." The council dismissed slowly. No applause, no praise, only a few quiet nods. But Eliakim didn't need approval. He needed obedience to the one who gave him the key. Later that night, he stood at the southern gate as the sun dropped behind the hills. A long line of weary travelers waited, pressed shoulder to shoulder, eyes anxious. The guards turned to him. "What are your orders, Steward?" He looked at them, then at the people, then at the wide, creaking gate behind him. "Open it," he said. The hinges groaned as the doors swung back, and the people came. Dusty feet, silent tears, thankful eyes. A mother placed her hand over Eliakim's and whispered, "You open the door? No one else would." He didn't reply. He just nodded and stepped aside, because leadership wasn't about standing in front of the people. It was about making sure they had room to walk through. It didn't take long. 2 days after the gate was opened, the letters began arriving. Not scrolls from the king, not words from God, but folded silk paper notes from noble houses, hand-delivered by servants who wouldn't meet Eliakim's eyes. The first was from the house of Amariah, a family with grain fields near the outer walls. "If the gates remain open," it read, "we will be forced to withhold our yearly grain gift to the palace. We cannot risk our wagons among these strangers." The second was worse. It came from a military general who had once dined with King Uzziah. "The steward's duty is to protect the palace, not invite ruin to its doors. If weakness continues to rule the gates, my sword may find a different master." Eliakim read both letters twice. Then he folded them neatly and placed them in a drawer. He didn't burn them, but he didn't answer them either. That afternoon, as he walked through the palace courtyard, he passed several officials he had greeted just days earlier. This time, they didn't bow, didn't smile. One of them, an older man with a jeweled pin on his robe, turned his back completely. Eliakim said nothing, but the silence wrapped around his shoulders like a colder robe than the one he wore. Later that night, he found Priya, the steward's assistant, waiting near the olive garden beside the inner court. The younger man looked uneasy. "They're saying you've made enemies, sir." Eliakim nodded. "Truth tends to do that." Priya hesitated. "With respect, I served under Shebna, too. He was ruthless, but respected. And you're kind. But kindness doesn't buy loyalty in the court." Eliakim looked at him quietly. "Then let them sell their loyalty elsewhere. Mine was never for sale." He walked past Priya and into the quiet of the prayer chamber. The room smelled of cedar and old smoke. A small oil lamp flickered in the corner. And near the far wall, beside a cracked pillar, sat Isaiah. The prophet didn't speak right away, just watched Eliakim with eyes that saw far more than most. "The walls are louder than usual," Isaiah said at last. "Even the stone carries whispers." Eliakim sighed, lowering himself to the floor. "They've begun turning against me." "Not openly, just slowly, politely." Isaiah gave a quiet smile. "That's how most thrones fall. Not by sword, but by the silence of men who once clapped." Eliakim closed his eyes. "I don't want to be a throne. I just want to hold the key well." Isaiah leaned forward. "And that is why you were chosen. Do not forget, God doesn't place keys in proud hands. He places them in ones that tremble." Outside, the wind howled against the old stone. Inside, the oil lamp burned brighter. And though Eliakim had fewer friends than he had the week before, he was more certain than ever. The gate had to stay open. The people had to be protected, and the price of favor was never worth the weight of a soul. He returned to his chambers, sat down, wrote a letter to the king, not defending himself, not accusing the nobles, but simply reporting the facts. "We have opened the gate. The poor are fed. The wounded are healing. And yes, I have lost allies, but I have gained a clearer conscience." And he signed it not with flair, not with pride, but with truth. Eliakim, servant of the Lord, bearer of the key. The palace was unusually quiet that morning. No meetings, no messages, no arguments at the southern gate. Just the slow creak of sunlight inching across the floor in Eliakim's study. He sat at his desk, rereading Isaiah's scroll from the day of his appointment. He still didn't understand why he'd been chosen, but the words on the scroll reminded him it wasn't about understanding. It was about obedience. A knock came at the door. Software hesitant. Eliakim stood. "Enter." The door opened slowly, and in stepped a figure cloaked in deep blue, worn thin with dust and time. The man's face was older now, thinner, his eyes less proud, but the voice was unmistakable. Shebna. For a moment neither man spoke, not out of hatred, but because the air between them was too heavy for quick words. Eliakim was the first to nod. "I heard you left the city." Shebna gave a hollow smile. "Only for a time. I've been watching, listening." He stepped closer, his boots barely making a sound on the stone. "They say you opened the southern gate, that you stood against the nobles, that Isaiah's prophecy came true." Eliakim said nothing. He didn't need to. Shebna's eyes dropped to the floor. "Do you think I hated the people?" he asked quietly. "That I never cared?" Eliakim's voice was gentle. "I think you were afraid of losing what you built. So you built higher walls and forgot the ones crying outside them." Shebna sighed. He reached into his robe and pulled out a thin silver ring, the one that once bore the royal seal. He placed it gently on the table between them. "This was once my crown. Now it's just a memory I try not to hate." Eliakim looked at it but didn't reach for it. "You could have come back to accuse me," he said, "or demand your position." Shebna shook his head. I came because I need peace." He walked to the window, staring out at the olive groves beyond the palace. The tomb I carved for myself, he said with a sad chuckle. It's still there. But the closer I got to death, the more I realized I carved my name into stone, but left nothing alive behind. Eliakim stepped beside him. It's not too late. Legacy isn't built in marble. It's built in mercy. Shebna turned to him, eyes glassy. You are not the man I expected, Eliakim. You carry the key with humility. That's what I never understood, and why the Lord never let me keep it. The former steward bowed, not deeply, but fully, and then he turned to go. But before he reached the door, Eliakim spoke again. If you want to help, come with me tomorrow. We're rebuilding a garden near the old cistern, a place for prayer, for peace. Shebna paused, nodded once, and left in silence. Eliakim stood alone, watching the light stretch across the stone floor. He had faced the man who once held what he now carried, and he had not puffed up, he had not torn down. He had simply stayed faithful, because keys open more than doors. Sometimes they open hearts. The letter came in the early morning hours, pressed with the royal seal, delivered by a captain of the guard. Its message was brief, but its weight settled heavily on Eliakim's shoulders. Come at once. You will speak on behalf of the king. By midday, he was walking beneath the towering cedar beams of the king's outer court. Sunlight poured through high windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Servants knelt as he passed, but Eliakim's thoughts were elsewhere. This wasn't about the palace, or ceremony, or politics. This was about Assyria. Inside the chamber, King Hilkiah stood before a large map stretched across a table. His eyes were weary, sleepless. To his left stood Joah, the royal recorder. To his right, a messenger from Lachish, his robe torn, dust in his hair. And across the table, wrapped in dark linen and carrying a scroll sealed in iron, stood a new figure, the envoy of Sennacherib, king of Assyria. Hezekiah turned as Eliakim approached. You're here, the king said quietly. Eliakim bowed. At your word, my king. Hezekiah gestured toward the envoy. Assyria demands tribute. Again. They say Jerusalem is next. The envoy stepped forward, voice smooth as stone over water. Our king offers mercy, if your city surrenders peacefully. Otherwise, he will come with fire. The gods of the other nations didn't stop him. Neither will yours. Eliakim's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. You speak of gods made by men. But we serve the God who made heaven and earth. The envoy smirked. Then let him deliver you. If he's real. Eliakim said nothing more. He simply took the scroll, then turned to the king. Let me speak with the prophet, he said. Later that day, as twilight stretched across the hills, Eliakim stood once more in Isaiah's courtyard. The prophet sat beneath a fig tree, scribbling on a scrap of parchment. Without looking up, he said, You held your tongue. That was wise. Eliakim approached. They want gold, but they want fear more. They speak like they've already won. Isaiah rolled the parchment gently. They always do, before they fall. He looked up. Give the king this message. Do not be afraid of what you have heard. Sennacherib will not enter this city. He will return the way he came. Eliakim bowed his head. Even now, when they surround us, Even now, Isaiah said. That night, Eliakim returned to the palace. He stood before Hezekiah, not as a strategist, not as a diplomat, but as a steward of trust. The prophet says the Lord has heard. We will not fall by their hand. The king said nothing. He simply knelt and began to pray. In the following days, word spread that Assyria had surrounded Lachish. Fear crept through the city like a slow fog. But Eliakim? He walked the streets, checked the southern gate, sat with widows, prayed over children. He did not panic. Because faith doesn't always roar. Sometimes it holds the line when others start to tremble. The trumpet blast came at midday, not from the palace and not from the temple, but from the Assyrian camp now stationed just beyond the northern tower. It echoed across the rooftops, sharp, confident, cruel. Eliakim was in the middle of distributing grain rations at the courtyard storehouse when a soldier rushed to him, breathless. They're back, the envoy, at the wall. He's calling for an audience, not with the king this time, but with the people. Eliakim closed his eyes for one breath, just one, then handed the measuring scale to Priya and turned toward the northern gate. When he arrived, a crowd had already formed along the upper walkways and guard posts. Children on their fathers' shoulders, mothers gripping their shawls, fishermen, gatekeepers, stone carvers, and temple servants, all watching the man standing just beyond the city wall, the Rabshakeh, the Assyrian king's mouthpiece, draped in black, standing tall on a rise of stone. He didn't speak to Eliakim. He spoke over him, to the people, loud, sharp, slow. Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot save you. His voice cut like iron through the afternoon heat. Do not let him make you trust in your God, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Did the gods of Samaria save them? Did the gods of Arpad or Sepharvaim stop my armies? What makes you think your God will stop me? Gasps rippled through the crowd. Children clutched their mothers. Men looked at each other, uncertain. A few backed away from the wall. One even whispered, maybe he's right. And then Eliakim stepped forward. Not onto the wall, but to the center of the crowd. He lifted both hands, not to silence them, but to call their eyes. People of Jerusalem, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. You've heard his words. You've seen their swords. And now, you must decide. Who commands your peace? He turned slowly, meeting as many eyes as he could. The king of Assyria rules soldiers. But our king, our God, he rules the sea. The wind stirred lightly as he went on. We do not need to outshout them. We do not need to match their chariots. We only need to stand together and believe that the one who parted the waters can hold the walls. A silence fell, thicker than fear, deeper than doubt. The Rabshakeh sneered from outside the wall, give me your answer. Who will speak for the city? Eliakim walked up to the top of the rampart, stood straight, and said nothing. Only one reply had been given, the one that mattered. And he turned his back on the enemy without fear. He walked down the ramp slowly as the people stared after him, not with panic, but with something new. Peace. The kind that follows someone who refuses to be rattled. Later that night, Eliakim met privately with Hezekiah. He handed him a folded parchment. "They spoke blasphemy," he said, "but we did not shout back." The king nodded, his voice quiet. "You carried more than a key today, Eliakim. You carried their hope." Eliakim bowed his head, and for the first time in days, he smiled. Because silence, when anchored in faith, still speaks. The next morning felt like the stillness before a storm. No arrows flew. No ladders were raised. The Assyrian army remained in their camp, silent, unmoving, patient like wolves at the base of a cliff. But Jerusalem? Jerusalem held its breath. In the palace, King Hezekiah sat in the chamber of the ark, his robe torn at the edges, dust on his head, grief in his eyes. Before him was the letter from the Rabshakeh, words soaked in mockery, threats, and pride. "Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you. No God has delivered a nation from my master's hand. Who is your God that he should deliver Jerusalem?" Hezekiah did not answer the letter with a pen. He took it to the temple and laid it before the Lord. Face down, mouth silent, heart wide open. Eliakim stood just outside the inner court, waiting with Joah and the scribe Shebna, who no longer carried power, but whose voice had grown more cautious since the last time they spoke. At last, the king emerged. His voice was low but clear. "Go to Isaiah," he said. "Tell him what has been spoken. Tell him the children are ready to be born, but there is no strength to deliver them. Perhaps the Lord your God will hear." Without hesitation, Eliakim turned and left the temple steps behind. The road to Isaiah's home twisted through olive groves and down into a quiet ravine. There were no guards, no trumpets, only the sound of sandals brushing dust and the faint wind pressing through the branches above. When Eliakim arrived, Isaiah was already seated beneath the fig tree in the courtyard, a small clay bowl of ink beside him. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. "The king has spoken," Isaiah said, dipping his reed into the ink. "He has humbled himself before the Lord, so now the Lord will speak." Eliakim stepped forward. "The enemy waits outside our walls," he said, "and inside these walls, the people wait for a word." Isaiah looked up, and his eyes were fire and calm all at once. "Then give them this. Thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words you have heard. I will send a spirit into him, and he shall hear a rumor, and return to his own land. And I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own country." Eliakim's hands trembled slightly as he received the scroll. "He will fall?" he asked. Isaiah nodded once. "He will not touch Jerusalem, not even with one arrow." By the time Eliakim returned to the palace, the sun was low in the sky. He repeated every word, line for line, before the king and the officials. Hezekiah listened in silence. Then he stood, placed both hands on the arms of his throne, and declared, "Then we will wait, not for a sword, not for a sign, but for our God." The people were told that night, not through shouting, not through banners, just through whispers and watchmen and quiet voices at household doors. "The prophet has spoken. The Lord has heard. We must hold fast." And so they did. For 3 days, Jerusalem braced itself like a mother in labor. No one left the gates. No one questioned the silence. They waited, prayed, watched. And every night, Eliakim climbed the wall and stood beneath the stars, not to look for the enemy, but to remember the promise. The fourth morning came like the others, gray, tense, and still. The watchmen saw no movement from the Assyrian camp, no war drums, no new ladders or siege towers, just tents, lined up perfectly, but unmoving. By midday, the whisper had spread across Jerusalem. Something's wrong. The gates remained shut, but the tension thickened. Even the birds circled wider over the outer hills. King Hezekiah summoned Eliakim just before dusk. The throne room was quiet, lit only by the dim glow of oil lamps. The king's voice was grave but curious. The scouts say they haven't seen a torch lit in the Assyrian camp for a full day, and the smoke from their fires has stopped. He looked Eliakim in the eye. I trust your steps. Go, see what the Lord has done. By nightfall, Eliakim rode out on horseback with 2 trusted guards, slipping through the narrow gate beneath the northern watchtower. The sky was iron gray, the air unusually cold. No arrows flew, no horns sounded. And yet, a silence, unlike any he had ever known, cloaked the fields. They dismounted near the edge of the Assyrian perimeter. Still, no movement. Eliakim crouched low and gave the signal to advance. Step by step, they moved through the outskirts. First past the outer tents, then into the rows. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Bodies, dozens, then hundreds. Soldiers, strong men, well-fed, fully armored, lay in perfect stillness. No wounds, no signs of struggle, no spilled blood, just silence. Eliakim's breath caught. He stepped farther in, past a captain's tent, then a royal pavilion, then the war altar of Sennacherib himself. All abandoned. The air hung thick with the smell of cedar oil and cold ash. They're gone, one guard whispered. No, Eliakim said softly. They've fallen. He knelt near the command tent and pulled back the flap. Inside lay what looked like the general of the Assyrian guard, eyes open, still, a sword in its sheath, never drawn. Eliakim rose slowly, awe in his chest like thunder waiting to roll. This wasn't done by man, he murmured. This was the hand of God. At dawn, the men returned to Jerusalem. They didn't need trumpets. Their faces told the story. And before the sun had fully risen, word passed from gate to gate. They're gone. The army has fallen. The Lord has delivered us. That morning, Jerusalem didn't shout in triumph. They wept, knelt, sang low songs in courtyards and fields. And Eliakim stood again beside the southern gate. Only now it wasn't to open it for the desperate, but to witness what mercy looks like when justice moves in silence. The city celebrated for 3 days. Not with parades, but with prayers. Temple singers lined the courts, their voices rising like morning incense. Fathers lifted children high on their shoulders, pointing toward the empty fields where an enemy once stood. And neighbors who once argued over water or land now embraced in the street. Eliakim watched it all quietly from the palace balcony. He said little, but he listened. The name Eliakim had begun to carry new weight in the city, no longer whispered, no longer questioned, now spoken with honor. The faithful steward, the one who stood on the wall, the one who did not flinch. Merchants sent gifts: bread, cloth, oils. One wealthy noble offered him land outside the eastern gate. Another invited him to dine in a private hall just to be seen. He refused politely, but their eyes lingered. Not with hatred this time, with expectation. And that was when Eliakim began to feel something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was ease. For the first time, there were no fires to put out, no envoys to silence, no armies to withstand, just smooth days and silent evenings. One night, he sat beneath the olive tree in the inner court, alone, the steward's seal around his neck, glinting in the moonlight. He turned it over in his hands. For the first time in weeks, he asked himself, "Am I still carrying this for the people? Or am I starting to carry it for myself?" The thought stung. He tucked the seal away in his robe and stood. At that moment, Isaiah stepped from the shadows of the walkway, as if drawn by the same wind that stirred Eliakim's questions. "Peace can be louder than war," the prophet said gently. "It sings lullabies that make strong men forget who they are." Eliakim looked up. "I feel it," he said. "The pride, the weight, shifting. They praise me more than they pray to God." Isaiah nodded. "Then remind them with how you lead in stillness. Not by turning praise away with words, but by turning your heart back with worship." Eliakim bowed his head. The prophet turned to leave but paused. "Remember, steward, God didn't raise you because you were strong. He raised you because you were steady. Stay that way." The next morning, Eliakim walked through the city, not in his royal robes, but in his older servant's tunic. He visited the southern gate, then the baker near the lower pools, then the widow who always sat beneath the fig tree. He helped repair a broken water basin with his own hands. The people noticed, not because he made a speech, but because he remembered who he was. And in the middle of a peaceful city, Eliakim did the hardest thing a leader can do. He kept his heart low. The city celebrated for 3 days, not with parades, but with prayers. Temple singers lined the courts, their voices rising like morning incense. Fathers lifted children high on their shoulders, pointing toward the empty fields where an enemy once stood. And neighbors who once argued over water or land now embraced in the street. Eliakim watched it all quietly from the palace balcony. He said little, but he listened. The name Eliakim had begun to carry new weight in the city, no longer whispered, no longer questioned, now spoken with honor. The faithful steward, the one who stood on the wall, the one who did not flinch. Merchants sent gifts: bread, cloth, oils. One wealthy noble offered him land outside the eastern gate. Another invited him to dine in a private hall just to be seen. He refused politely, but their eyes lingered, not with hatred this time, with expectation. And that was when Eliakim began to feel something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was ease. For the first time, there were no fires to put out, no envoys to silence, no armies to withstand, just smooth days and silent evenings. One night, he sat beneath the olive tree in the inner court, alone, the steward's seal around his neck, glinting in the moonlight. He turned it over in his hands. For the first time in weeks, he asked himself, "Am I still carrying this for the people? Or am I starting to carry it for myself? The thought stung. He tucked the seal away in his robe and stood. At that moment, Isaiah stepped from the shadows of the walkway, as if drawn by the same wind that stirred Eliakim's questions. Peace can be louder than war, the prophet said gently. It sings lullabies that make strong men forget who they are. Eliakim looked up. I feel it, he said. The pride, the weight, shifting. They praise me more than they pray to God. Isaiah nodded. Then remind them with how you lead in stillness. Not by turning praise away with words, but by turning your heart back with worship. Eliakim bowed his head. The prophet turned to leave but paused. Remember, Steward, God didn't raise you because you were strong. He raised you because you were steady. Stay that way. The next morning, Eliakim walked through the city, not in his royal robes but in his older servant's tunic. He visited the southern gate, then the baker near the lower pools, then the widow who always sat beneath the fig tree. He helped repair a broken water basin with his own hands. The people noticed, not because he made a speech, but because he remembered who he was. And in the middle of a peaceful city, Eliakim did the hardest thing a leader can do. He kept his heart low. The news came with no trumpet, no shout, no messenger racing through the streets, just a whisper from a servant in gray. The king, he has collapsed. It was early morning. Eliakim was in the temple courtyard overseeing grain offerings when the words reached him. He froze. The wind stopped. Even the birds seemed to fall silent above the city. He didn't ask for details. He ran. By the time he reached the palace, the corridors were thick with tension. Advisors murmured. Servants huddled. A physician emerged from the king's chamber, face pale and drawn. Eliakim caught him by the arm. Speak plainly. The man swallowed hard. A fever. Sudden. Violent. He isn't responding. We've sent for Isaiah. Inside the king's chamber, Hezekiah lay motionless, sweat streaking his face, breath shallow. The room was dim, but grief was already starting to cast its shadow. Eliakim stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing. But inside, his heart thundered. Lord, not now. Not like this. Not when we just learn to live again. By dusk, the prophet came. Isaiah entered the chamber without a word to anyone but the king. He leaned low, spoke softly, and emerged only minutes later. Eliakim followed him out. What did you say? Isaiah paused. The Lord says, set your house in order, for you will not recover. The word struck Eliakim like a sword, but he did not cry out. He bowed his head. Then we must prepare. That night, as the city slept, Eliakim didn't. He wrote instructions for the palace guards, spoke with the high priest about a succession plan, ordered fasting across the city at sunrise. He did not declare a crisis. He declared dependence. If the king fades, the throne does not rule us. The Lord rules us. But even as he worked, he returned often to the hallway outside the king's chamber. He never went inside, just stood, prayed, waited. On the third night, a guard approached. Hezekiah is speaking. Eliakim entered quietly. Hezekiah's face was pale, but his voice, though cracked, was clear. I wept before the Lord, the king said. I reminded him of how I've walked in his ways, not perfectly, but honestly. And I asked for more years. Eliakim stepped closer. And? The king looked toward the door. Isaiah was there again, this time smiling faintly. The Lord has added 15 years to his life, Isaiah said, and he will defend this city once more for his name's sake. Tears brimmed in Eliakim's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He knelt at the side of the bed. Then we will serve faithfully for every one of those days. Word spread at dawn. The king had been healed. The Lord had heard. And once again, the city was spared, this time not by the fall of an army, but by the mercy of God in a sick room. Eliakim stepped onto the palace steps as the people gathered. He raised his hands, not to boast, but to point. You asked how we stand without a king? You asked what would happen if the crown faded. Now you see. We stand not because the king lives, but because the Lord never left. And in the quiet that followed, Jerusalem bowed, not to a throne, but to the one who had proved again that he alone is king. They arrived with polished chariots and banners of blue, men from Babylon, wealthy, regal, and curious. They brought honeyed fruit, rare ointments, scrolls with strange symbols, and their greetings dripped with charm. We heard of your king's illness and his healing. We've heard of your God's power. We've heard of the city that never fell. At first it seemed harmless. King Hezekiah welcomed them warmly. He was eager to share what the Lord had done, and the envoys listened with nods and polite laughter. Then they asked to see the palace, the treasury, the temple courts, and Hezekiah said yes. Eliakim watched in silence as golden shields were carried out to be polished. Incense was lit. The royal scribes paraded their scrolls. Even the sacred vessels normally hidden deep within the temple were carefully shown. They must know that Jerusalem is not weak, the king said proudly, that we are not merely survivors, we are strong. But Eliakim's heart stirred uneasily. He watched the Babylonian envoys as they smiled. Too closely, took notes, too discreetly, and whispered too softly. That evening, Eliakim sought Isaiah beneath the olive trees outside the wall. The prophet was waiting, as if he already knew. They've seen too much, Eliakim said quietly. They came praising our God, but they left writing about our gold. Isaiah closed his eyes. Not all enemies shout from beyond the walls, he said. Some come in peace and leave with plans. He looked at Eliakim long and hard. Go to the king. Tell him the Lord has spoken. Everything they saw, every treasure, every scroll, every vessel will one day be carried away. Not now, not soon, but one day. Because pride opened a door that wisdom would have kept closed. Eliakim returned to the palace late that night. He told the king everything. Hezekiah stood still, quiet, ashamed. There was no threat, he said, only admiration. Eliakim met his eyes. But not all admiration is honest. And not every open door is a godly one. The next morning, Eliakim quietly gathered the temple servants. He spoke no accusation, only instruction. The treasures of God are not for show, he said, Not everything holy must be seen to be real. He walked the halls of the palace, closing what had been opened. Scrolls were returned, vessels re-wrapped, gates re-guarded, not out of fear, but out of faithfulness, because Eliakim knew something that few understood. Miracles are not invitations to show off. They are reminders to stay humble. And as the Babylonians disappeared over the hill, their wheels creaking faintly into the wind, Jerusalem exhaled. But Eliakim, he kept watch, not over enemies, but over the hearts of his own people. Years passed, not in parades, not in wars, but in seeds quietly growing. The gates of Jerusalem remained open for the stranger. The temple stayed clean. The scribes taught truth. The people remembered, though not always perfectly, who their deliverer had been. And Eliakim? He never chased a title. He never built a statue. He never carved his name into stone, but he was there every morning, every evening. He walked the outer walls long after most had forgotten the siege. He watched children run through the same streets where soldiers once stood in fear. He greeted merchants with grace, reminded Levites to rest, and gave his bread to widows when no one was looking. His beard grayed, his hands stiffened, his steps slowed, but his peace never faded. One morning, as the sun stretched over the city, Eliakim sat beneath the old fig tree near the southern gate, the same place where, years before, he had chosen to keep it open when others demanded it be shut. A young steward in training approached, nervous. "Sir," the boy said, bowing awkwardly, "the scribes said you once stood on the wall during the siege. Is it true?" Eliakim smiled faintly. "I did. But the wall didn't matter as much as the people standing behind it." The boy sat beside him. What was it like, leading in a time like that? Eliakim didn't answer immediately. He looked out toward the hills, the same ones where chariots once camped, now blooming with barley. "It wasn't loud," he finally said. "Leadership, I mean. It was quiet, like walking in the dark with a lamp you didn't light yourself. You just had to keep it from going out." The boy didn't fully understand, but he listened. And that was enough. That evening, Eliakim returned to his chambers. He took the steward's seal from the drawer, no longer worn, just kept, like a memory. He wrapped it in linen and placed it beside a scroll, not one he had written, but the one Isaiah gave him long ago. "I will give him the key of the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut. What he shuts, no one can open." And then he prayed, "Lord, I didn't ask for the key, but you gave it. And I tried, with everything I had, to carry it well. Now, let me lay it down." That night, the city did not mourn, because nothing was announced. No trumpet was blown, no title was passed, but heaven took note of the servant who never led for applause, of the steward who opened the door for the weak and closed it gently behind him, of the man who proved that power held with humility can shape a nation more than power held with force. His name is hardly mentioned in the scrolls of kings, but in the kingdom of God, he is remembered, because some keys unlock palaces, and some keys unlock eternity.